The wind moved like a whisper over the empty plain, tugging at the broken fence posts and moaning low beneath the eaves of the Mercer homestead, as if the land itself remembered better days. The morning didn't rise so much as it crept. Pale light spilled over the ridges of Dry Creek Bluff, casting long shadows across the brittle earth. The old windmill creaked like a tired joint, spinning slow and off-kilter, its rusted frame slicing at the sun. The house stood lopsided against the sky, patched together with stubbornness and splintered wood. Smoke coiled from the chimney in weak ribbons, curling into the cold, like it too had lost its way. When Grady had once asked his father why the willow tree up on the hill never bloomed like the others, Elias had paused before answering. "Some roots grow where sorrow lies," he'd said, rubbing a thumb across the calluses on his palm. "And sorrow don't need sunlight." That tree still leaned, bent by years of wind and memory. And down below it, Elias Mercer sat on the porch steps, a coffee cup cooling in his hand, the horizon painting itself in rust and lavender. His face bore the years, but not in lines, in silence, in how long he stared at nothing, in the way he exhaled like he didn't expect the breath to come back. Behind him, the door creaked open. "Pa," came a small voice, ragged with sleep and dust. "We got any eggs left?" Elias turned. Grady stood barefoot, his hair a nest of straw and curls, holding one boot like it had betrayed him. "Reckon we might," Elias said, motioning toward the coop with a nod. "But them hens ain't been generous this week. I'll check anyhow." The boy scampered off, kicking up dust as he went, the world still too big for him to worry about its cruelties. Elias sipped what remained of the coffee. Cold, bitter, but it kept his hands busy. He had long since stopped drinking for warmth. There wasn't much to look forward to anymore, only chores and the slow unraveling of whatever life he'd once imagined here. Since Sarah passed, the house had grown quieter, not just in sound, but in spirit. She'd been the laughter in the corners, the hum of a tune in the kitchen, the one who made silence feel like peace instead of punishment. He hadn't touched her side of the bed in 2 years. Some ghosts were meant to stay undisturbed. It was near 8 when the livery wagon rolled up the bluff. The creak of the wheels, the rattle of harness leather. They sounded foreign, like something from a different life. Silas Creedy sat at the reins, back hunched, his whiskers yellowed from tobacco. The mule looked as tired as its owner. "You're up early," Elias called, setting down the cup. Silas spat into the dirt and adjusted his hat. "Ain't the kind of day to sleep through." Elias stood, joints aching with the cold. "Something wrong?" Silas scratched his chin. "Ain't wrong, exactly, but there's a situation down at the station. Woman come in on the morning train. Nobody to meet her." Elias squinted. "That your business?" "Only reason it's mine is because it ain't nobody else's," Silas replied. "Folks down there are treatin' it like some damn carnival, laughin', jeerin'. She's just standin' there. One trunk and a letter sayin' she's to be wed. Man never showed." Elias felt the weight in Silas's voice. Not urgency. Something slower. Shame. "Why you telling me?" Silas shrugged. "Thought maybe you'd want to see for yourself. You ain't like the rest of 'em. Least you used to be." Elias didn't respond at first. He looked out toward the barn, then up at the willow, then at the faint trail of dust curling from the chicken coop where Grady hunted eggs. "I don't have room for trouble," he said finally. "Who said anything about taking her in?" Silas asked. "Just don't let her stand there alone." Elias sighed. The air felt heavier than before. He turned toward the house. "Grady," he called, "you're in charge of the hens." "I already am," came the muffled reply. By the time he reached the station in 6 Stones, the town had already drawn its conclusion. A few boys loitered on the porch railings, spitting seeds and sharing jokes not worth the breath. A woman leaned against the post office wall with arms crossed, eyes hard and unreadable. The general store clerk stood by his barrels, pretending to sweep. She stood alone at the edge of the platform. Her dress, once proper, was now dust-stained and clinging to her, like it regretted the journey. 2 trunks sat beside her, one with a torn handle, the other with brass corners dulled by age. A third item, a weathered satchel, lay at her feet, like an afterthought. She wasn't what Elias expected. She was taller than most women, wide-shouldered and strong-bodied. Her hair was pinned up tight, her jaw square and set, but it wasn't her size that struck him. It was how still she stood, like she was daring the world to knock her over. "Too fat for her own good," someone muttered nearby. "Can't believe any man'd want that." "She'll eat him out of house and home," said another. Elias stopped walking. Something in his chest stirred, not pity exactly, a low simmering anger that made his hands clench. He stepped forward. "What's the trouble here?" he said, loud enough to quiet the porch. A few eyes turned his way, surprised to see him speak. Elias Mercer didn't meddle, didn't visit, didn't take sides. Silas's voice rang from somewhere behind him. "Ain't no trouble, Elias. Just a woman left waitin' on a man who ain't worth his boots." The woman turned then. Her eyes met his, steady, proud, wounded, not begging, just tired. "You got a name?" Elias asked. "Temperance," she said. "Temperance Lark." He looked at her satchel. "You got somewhere else to go?" "No," she answered, voice sharp but clean. "I was promised a place here. Seems that was a lie." Elias looked around. The town had already turned away, interest fading. He scratched his beard, thought of the empty chair at his table, the quiet nights, the willow tree. "I got a place," he said, surprising even himself. "Run down, but you're welcome until you find your footing." Her expression shifted. Suspicion first, then something softer. "Why?" "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere left to go." Silas chuckled behind him. "Ain't that a sight? Elias Mercer taken in strays." Temperance looked at Elias again, studying his face for any cruelty he might be hiding. Finding none, she nodded. "I thank you, Mr. Mercer. Truly." "It's just Elias," he said, lifting one of her trunks onto his shoulder. "Come on. Best get moving before the heat sets in." They didn't speak much as they rode back. The mule cart moved slow, but steady. The wind pushed at their backs. Dust danced across the road like memory, always there, always waiting. Dry Creek Bluff came into view, just as the sun tilted westward. The house crouched low against the hill. The barn sagged, the fence leaned, the coop was barely upright. Temperance looked at it all without a word. Elias helped unload the trunks, gestured toward the porch. "Ain't much, but it's honest." She nodded once. "Honesty's more than I've had in a while." Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and old iron. Grady ran in barefoot, his shirt untucked, face bright. "Pa," he shouted, "we got company?" "This is Miss Lark," Elias said. "She'll be staying a while." Grady blinked, then he grinned. "You look strong. Stronger than Pa." Temperance's lips curled at the edges. "I eat my vegetables." Grady laughed, then ran off again, already content with the change. That night, Elias sat by the fire, coffee cup in hand, watching the flames flicker. Temperance slept on the cot, turned toward the wall. Grady snored softly in the other room. The house felt fuller, not loud, not warm, but less hollow. The wind tapped against the window pane. Outside, the willow tree swayed, not in mourning, but maybe, just maybe, in acknowledgement. As the coals sank low, Temperance stirred. She whispered, "This place, It's not what I imagined. Elias stared into the dark and replied, Neither was life. The dawn split across the valley in a blaze of copper and rose, but inside the Mercer cabin, the warmth stopped at the door. Elias rose early, as he always did, shrugging on his coat with slow, deliberate hands. The air had a sharp edge to it that morning, nipping through the cracks in the walls and curling around the seams of the windows, like a cold-blooded thing looking for a place to nest. He moved without sound, boots brushing the warped floorboards with the weariness of ritual. The fire had burned low during the night. He stirred the embers back to life, coaxing flame from ash, watching as the shadows pulled back just enough to show the small shape lying on the cot near the hearth. Temperance Lark hadn't stirred. She lay on her side, one arm tucked under her head, the other resting across her middle. Her coat was folded neatly beneath her like a cushion, and her boots stood at the edge of the rug. Perfectly aligned. Even in sleep, there was a sort of order to her, a deliberate neatness that spoke of someone who never allowed themselves to truly rest. Outside, the chickens began to cluck, restless and loud in the growing light. Elias stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. The sky above Dry Creek Bluff was wide open, streaked with high clouds the color of faded cotton. The wind carried the scent of dry sage and brittle weeds, and far off, he could hear the familiar rattle of Silas's mule cart heading back down the trail to Six Stones. He was halfway to the barn when he caught sight of Grady crouched beside the coop, whispering something to the hens. The boy wore a crown of twigs and feathers, his shirt tucked into his trousers with more hope than success. Elias smiled despite himself. "She's still here," Grady said without looking up. "She is. Is she staying?" "That's her choice." Grady stood and brushed his hands against his pants. "I hope she does. She don't look scared." Elias tilted his head. "Scared of what?" "Of us. Of this place." The boy's honesty cut through him sharper than the wind. He nodded once, then walked to the barn to start the chores. The feed was low. The tools were dull. The fence around the pasture had lost 2 more rails since last week. Nothing around here held together the way it used to. By the time he returned to the house, the smell of boiled coffee and iron skillet was in the air. Temperance stood in the kitchen corner, apron over her skirt, stirring something in a dented pot. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her arms strong and ruddy from the cold. The table had been cleared, dishes washed, the cot folded and pushed back toward the wall. Grady sat at the table, happily swinging his legs as he tore into a heel of bread. "I didn't mean to overstep," she said without turning. "Seemed wrong to sit around with hands that work." Elias set down his gloves. "Ain't no overstep. Just wasn't expecting breakfast." She glanced over her shoulder. "Most folks don't expect much from me, so I like to surprise 'em." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her with eyes that revealed nothing, but noticed everything. The way she moved with purpose. The way her brow furrowed when she measured flour, the slight limp in her step when she shifted weight. An old injury, maybe. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. "My mother," she replied, "when I wasn't out mending fences or chasing hogs." Grady grinned. "You chased hogs? Better than letting 'em chase me." The 3 of them ate quietly. The stew was thick, salty, and surprisingly good. Afterward, Grady insisted on showing her the rest of the homestead, the coop, the goat pen, the place behind the barn where he buried bottle caps and imaginary treasures. She followed him like an old friend, listening to his stories, laughing in low, warm tones that made the air feel less cold. Elias watched from the porch. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry, but she listened, and that made all the difference. Later, when Grady had tired himself out and wandered off to sketch shapes in the dust with a stick, Temperance returned to the cabin, brushing straw from her skirt. "Place is in bad shape," she said, "but it's got bones." Elias nodded. "That it does. You ever fix that fence in the east pasture?" "Haven't had time." "Got a hammer?" "Somewhere." She didn't wait for permission, just rolled up her sleeves and headed toward the barn. He followed out of instinct, still not sure what to make of her. Folks didn't usually come here offering help. They came for favors, or to collect on them. By midday, she'd driven 4 nails, replaced a cracked board, and cleared the debris from the fence line without saying a word. Her hands were calloused, her knuckles scraped, but her face held a focus that reminded Elias of the way Sarah used to look when mending a tear in Grady's shirt. "She's tougher than she looks," he muttered to himself. That evening, the 3 of them sat at the rough-hewn table. The lantern threw golden light across the walls, catching the glint of Elias's old Union medal pinned to the shelf, the only decoration that hadn't been buried or burned. Grady talked about the sky, how it looked like a painting smudged by angels. Temperance smiled, but her eyes stayed low, watching the stew swirl in her bowl. After dinner, Elias stepped outside to smoke. The wind had calmed. Crickets chirped in the distance. He didn't hear her approach until she was beside him. "You don't talk much," she said. "Never saw the point in sayin' what don't need sayin'." She nodded. "But I'd like to earn my place, not just sleep on your floor and stir your pots." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the way men had in town, sizing her up like livestock, but the way one storm-worn soul regards another. "You already did," he said. They stood in silence for a while. The stars above them began to bloom in the dark. The next morning, Elias rode into 6 Stones for supplies. The general store was quieter than usual. The clerk avoided eye contact. A woman near the barrels muttered under her breath as he passed. Word had gotten around. He returned home with a clenched jaw and a heavy heart. Grady met him at the gate, waving excitedly, but Elias barely noticed. Temperance was chopping wood near the shed, sleeves rolled, breath rising in clouds. "Walker's been talkin'," Elias said. "Said you're not natural. Said you're working the land like a man possessed." She rested the axe on the stump. "He afraid of a woman doing a man's job?" "He's looking for trouble. Always has. Tried to buy this land years back. Didn't like that I said no." "He think I'm the reason you're sayin' no again?" "Don't matter what he thinks, but it might matter what he does." She wiped sweat from her brow. "Well, I ain't runnin'. Not from him or anybody." That night Grady sat between them by the fire, playing with a wooden horse he'd carved from scrap. Temperance stitched a tear in her skirt. Elias read an old letter, the edges curled and brown. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things unsaid, of memories and meanings and moments waiting to matter. Elias glanced at her, saw the way her eyes moved across the flames, steady, but tired. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. "Thought about it every day since I arrived," she said. "But not today." He didn't respond, but he didn't look away. In the middle of the night, she stirred. The wind had picked up again, howling through the cracks in the cabin like a voice that had lost its tongue. She rose to check the shutters. As she passed the front door, she caught a glint. Something sharp. She opened the door slowly. There, just beyond the porch rail, nailed into the fence post, was a scrap of paper fluttering in the breeze. Written in crude charcoal strokes, it read, "You don't belong here." And underneath, just faintly, the trace of a horseshoe imprint in the mud, not from Elias's stock. She reached out, tore the paper free, and stared into the darkness. Back inside, the fire hissed, and outside, the willow tree swayed again, but not from the wind. The silence between 2 people can either be a bridge or a canyon. Sometimes it takes a storm to know which. A storm had not yet come to Dry Creek Bluff in thunder or rain, but something heavy, was building in the air. Elias Mercer felt it long before it showed its face. The signs were subtle. The quiet way the birds had stopped singing at midday, the way the goats shifted uneasily in their pen, and how even Grady's laughter carried an edge of restraint. The cabin walls, for all their creaks and gaps, had begun to feel tighter somehow, like the very air within them had thickened with waiting. It wasn't just the land, and it wasn't just the weather. It was the sense that someone, somewhere, had decided to lean a little harder on the pressure, just to see what would crack. Grady had once said to Temperance, "You don't talk like folks here. It's like you're from a place where words mean something." She'd smiled at the time, but now those words settled like a weight in her chest. Every day here, every step forward, made her more certain she had never belonged anywhere else, and more fearful that she might still be pushed out. The goal of this day was not to change everything, just to hold steady, but even that would prove harder than it seemed. That morning, the sun rose sharp and white, already warming the dust that clung to the hills and fences. The old telegraph line that once cut across the trail into town now hung slack, broken in places where hawks had perched and storms had tugged. A red-tailed fox watched the trail from a distant ridge, unmoving, eyes like embers under shadow. Temperance had risen before the others. She had taken to keeping her hands busy before sunrise, clearing the ash from the stove, straightening the tool shed, sorting nails into old coffee tins. The rhythm kept her thoughts from pulling her under. Her body moved from task to task, as if wired into the bones of the place. And maybe she was. Each hammer swing, each bundle of straw she tied, stitched her deeper into the land, whether Elias realized it or not. When Elias stepped out onto the porch, she was already halfway through patching the lower fence near the east pasture. The morning light caught the curve of her shoulders, the muscles of her back working beneath the fabric of her dress as she lifted and nailed a new slat in place. "She doesn't stop," he murmured to himself, holding his coffee near his chest, letting the steam warm his beard. Grady came tumbling out the door behind him, his hair sticking in all directions. "Miss Thames out already?" "Been out since before I got up," Elias replied. Grady squinted into the light. "She's making this place less broken." Elias didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either. By noon, they had worked side by side without speaking more than a dozen words. Elias fixed the hinges on the barn door, while Temperance cleared out the root cellar and began storing the last of the canned goods. The silence between them was less awkward than it once had been. Less canyon, more bridge, but still guarded. There were things neither had dared to say. That changed when Elias returned from town. He rode up slow, the cart bouncing on the trail behind him, dust curling into the sky with each turn of the wheel. His hat sat low, his jaw clenched. Temperance noticed it before he even stepped down. "What happened?" she asked. Elias didn't answer at first. He unhitched the mule, stroked its neck once, then looked toward her with a gaze hard enough to shatter stone. "Burke Hollowell's talkin'," he said. "Claims you're not natural. Says folks seen you workin' this land like you're possessed, fixing fences, lifting things most men don't." She dropped the rag she'd been using to clean her hands. "He say that to your face?" "He said it to the whole store." "And you?" "I walked out," Elias muttered. "Could have done more. Maybe should have. But I walked out." Temperance stood still, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I've heard worse," she said after a moment. "That don't make it right." "No, it doesn't." He moved to pick up the grain sack, but she stepped in his way. "You need to understand something, Elias. Men like Hollowell, they don't hate me because I'm strange. They hate me because I remind them what they're not." Elias looked at her then, really looked. There was no shame in her face, no pleading, just a fire that hadn't dimmed despite everything this land and its people had tried to smother. He's looking for an excuse, Elias said quietly. Always has. He wanted this land 10 years ago, before Sarah died. Claimed I wasn't working it proper. That's how he gets in. Through gossip and greed. He thinks I'm your weakness now. He don't understand that you might be the thing holding this place together. That night, after dinner, Grady wandered off to his room with a tired yawn, dragging his toy horse by the leg. Elias sat by the hearth, poking at the embers. Temperance folded the same dish rag 3 times before speaking. You regret taking me in? He didn't look up. No. Even with what folks are saying? Even with Hollowell breathing down your neck? I've lived too long to let cowards change my mind. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The lamp between them threw shadows across her face, soft but strong. You're hard to read, she said. I get that a lot. But I see the way you look at Grady. The way you keep fixin' things, even when you think it won't matter. He gave a half smile. You're not easy to read either. Good. I don't want to be. They sat in that slow, warm silence again, the kind that hummed like a song neither had words for. Later that week, Elias rode into 6 Stones again. This time, the silence hit harder. The townsfolk didn't whisper. They didn't look. They just moved around him like he wasn't there. Inside the general store, the clerk set down a bag of flour without a word. Elias paid and left, but he could feel it, that creeping coldness of a place that had already decided your guilt. Back at the bluff, Temperance found the barn door ajar. She stepped inside cautiously, the smell of manure and dry straw strong in the air. At first, everything looked normal. The tools lined along the wall, the feed stacked in its corner. Then she saw it. Scrawled across the far wall in blackened charcoal, large enough to stretch from beam to beam, were the words, "Witch's Whore." The letters curled and burned into her chest like brands. Her breath caught, not from fear, from rage, from that cold, trembling kind of fury that comes when you realize folks would rather see you gone than understand you. She scrubbed at the words with a brush, then with her sleeve, but they remained, a ghost of judgment that wouldn't lift. When Elias found her an hour later, she was still trying. Her hands raw and red, eyes glistening but dry. He didn't speak, just picked up a bucket and joined her. When the wall was finally clean, and the stain barely more than a shadow, she stood up and whispered, "They'll never stop." "No," Elias said, "but neither will we." That night, Grady watched the fire, chewing on a piece of jerky with a thoughtful expression. "Miss Tem," he asked. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Was your mama like you?" Temperance blinked. "How do you mean?" "Strong, big, not afraid." She smiled softly. "She was all those things. And kind, too. Like your mama, I imagine." Elias didn't speak, but his eyes flicked toward the closed door of the bedroom where Sarah's things still sat untouched, folded and silent like old prayers. "You talk to her?" Grady asked. "Your mama, I mean." "Sometimes," she said. "In my head, or when I'm alone. I think she listens." "Do you think Mama listens?" Elias finally spoke, his voice low. "I know she does." Later, when the house had gone quiet and the fire was dying low, Elias walked the property. The air was dry, and a sickle moon hung just above the trees. He passed the goat pen, the chicken coop, the barn. The scent of scorched leather lingered in the air, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled once and fell silent. He was halfway back to the house when he saw the note. It had been nailed to the gate, the same post where Temperance had once found the other message. This one was worse. Last warning. The hammer mark in the wood was unmistakable, sharp, deep, deliberate. It was Burke Hollowell's. The river hadn't flowed right in years, but it still remembered the shape of old cattle hooves and blood spilled in silence. Down by the dry bend of Bitter Creek, where the water used to cut clean through the land. Only trickles remained. A silver ribbon crawling slow through sand and rock, too stubborn to die outright. The reeds along the edge had yellowed, their roots clawing for moisture that no longer answered. Old bones of steer, sun-bleached and buried shallow, peeked from the dust like warnings. It was the kind of place that remembered things, even if folks had forgotten. When Grady had once asked why folks feared Hollowell, Elias hadn't lied. Because he doesn't fight fair, and he don't care who gets burned. Now those words were spinning through his mind, like wind through dead grass, brittle and sharp. It started before sunrise. The ground was still stiff with frost when Elias stepped out and noticed the eastern gate was hanging loose, chain snapped like a twig. He knelt beside it, fingers tracing fresh hoof prints in the mud. Too many, too deep. His heart sank with each step he followed. Cattle. Gone. He didn't speak a word as he saddled the mule, nor when he checked the rifle and loaded his belt. Temperance emerged from the cabin, still pulling on her coat, her hair braided tight against the wind. "What is it?" "Fence is cut," he said. "Cattle's been run off." She looked down the trail, then back at him. "You going after them?" He nodded, jaw clenched. "I'm coming with you." "No, this ain't your fight." "It is now." Elias met her gaze, unwavering, calm, but fierce as flint. She wasn't asking. She wasn't offering. She was going. "Fine," he said after a moment. "But you stay behind me. You see trouble. You fall back." "Understand?" Understood. The sun was just breaking over the bluff when they rode out, leaving Grady with a promise that they'd be home before dark. The boy nodded, eyes wide but trusting, his wooden horse clutched tight in one hand. The trail down to the creek was lined with twisted mesquite trees, their limbs reaching like claws into the pale sky. Birds scattered as the mule trotted past, and the only sound was the dry rustle of saddle leather and the distant moan of wind against stone. They followed the tracks for nearly an hour. Signs of the herd were easy to see, deep cloven marks along the soft creek bed, manure still warm in the cold morning air. But what caught Elias's attention most were the other tracks, bootprints, men, at least 2, maybe 3. Walking alongside the cattle, herding them with purpose. Hollowell's men. By the time they reached the curve in the creek, the land opened into a broad wash. Flat and bare, save for a few scraggly trees and the glint of metal where sunlight struck the barrels of rifles. 2 men stood near the stolen herd. One leaned against a twisted cedar, chewing on a stalk of grass. The other squatted by the water's edge, cleaning something that might have once been a knife. They didn't look surprised to see Elias and Temperance ride in. In fact, they smiled. "Well, well," the taller of the 2 drawled, standing and stretching his arms wide. "Look what the wind blew in." Elias pulled up the reins, staying just out of rifle range. Temperance stopped beside him, shotgun across her lap, fingers steady. "You're on my land," Elias said. The man grinned. "Funny. I was just about to say the same." "Take your lies elsewhere. Those are my cattle." The second man stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Don't see your name on 'em." "I got a brand. Paperwork says otherwise." Temperance shifted slightly in her saddle. "You boys think the law's on your side?" The taller man looked at her, eyes crawling. "Well now, she talks." "She does more than talk," Elias said. "Leave the cattle. Go back to your boss." "Or what?" The squatter smirked. "You'll shoot us?" "No," Temperance said, lifting her shotgun. "I will." The words weren't shouted. They weren't snarled. They were calm, firm, and final. And then the squatter moved, too fast, too sharp, reaching for the rifle slung over his back. Before Elias could react, the world cracked open. The blast from Temperance's shotgun ripped through the air, echoing down the dry wash like thunder. The man screamed, his weapon falling as he crumpled to the ground, blood soaking into the creek bed. The taller man froze, eyes wide with disbelief, hand half raised toward his revolver. Elias didn't wait. One clean shot from his sidearm, and the man fell backward into the dust, arms flailing once before. Stillness claimed him. Silence returned. Sudden and absolute. Even the cattle stood motionless, their breath steaming in the chill morning air. Temperance lowered the shotgun, her shoulders stiff, chest rising and falling in short bursts. Elias turned to her, voice low. "Damn, woman." She didn't speak, just stared at the man she'd shot, expression unreadable. "You just saved my life." She swallowed. Had to be done. They dismounted, checked the bodies. One was still breathing, barely. Elias tied his hands, dragged him to a tree, and left him there with a warning. If Hollowell wanted a war, he'd just gotten it. They herded the cattle slowly back toward the bluff, pushing them up the slope one tired hoof step at a time. The sun was higher now, the wind gentler, but the air still carried the weight of what had happened, of what could no longer be undone. On the ridge, the cabin came into view, smoke curling from the chimney. Grady stood in the yard, waving both arms overhead. Temperance didn't wave back. Her hands were trembling now, the shock finally settling into her bones. Elias rode closer, voice softer than she'd heard before. "You all right?" "No," she said, "but I'll manage." Inside the barn, after the herd was secured, she sat on a bale of hay and stared at her hands, scraped, blood-speckled, shaking. He handed her a cloth. She took it without speaking. "You did what had to be done," he said. "They'll call me worse than a witch now," she whispered. "Let them." Outside, the mule brayed. Inside, the fire crackled to life again. Neither of them saw the bullet hole in the side of the barn until later that evening. A clean shot, fired from a distance. A warning. A buzzard circled overhead as the wind picked up once more, pulling the scent of smoke and something darker across the ridge. 6 stones looked peaceful from afar, the way a thundercloud sometimes looks like shade. From the crest of Dry Creek Bluff, the town below shimmered in the early autumn light like a painting gone too long in the sun, all its edges blurred, its colors too still to trust. But even from that distance, Elias Mercer could feel the shift in it, not the bustle of markets or the hum of gossip. No. What had taken hold of 6 stones was something heavier, quieter, and colder than noise, the kind of silence a town wore like armor when it had already picked a side. Back at the cabin, the fire snapped in the hearth, and Temperance sat stitching the sleeve of one of Grady's shirts, though her needle trembled more than usual. The events by the river had taken a toll. She hadn't spoken much since, hadn't wept, hadn't raged, just moved through the days like a soul pulled too tight to fray. Yet in her silence was a hardness that hadn't been there before, a kind of resolve Elias recognized, though he'd hoped never to see again. Temperance had once told Grady, "Just because folks are quiet, don't mean they're kind." She'd said it like a passing thought, but now those words had roots, curling deeper into the foundation of the life they were trying to build. Today would not bring bloodshed. It would bring something worse. Isolation. The morning broke soft, with a layer of mist hanging low across the pasture, the kind of morning that hinted at coming frost. The earth was stiff underfoot, and the clouds moved slow, casting long shadows like ghost trails over the hills. In the yard, Elias loaded the cart with sacks of dried beans, tools to repair the henhouse, and what coin they had left, barely enough for grain and salt. He didn't want to go, but winter didn't wait for wounded pride, and the cattle wouldn't feed themselves. Grady helped tie the bundles, chattering about nonsense, eyes too bright. He was old enough to notice tension, but not old enough to understand its weight. "You'll be back by supper?" he asked. "If the town lets me," Elias muttered. Grady blinked. "Why wouldn't they?" Elias didn't answer. He ruffled the boy's hair and climbed into the cart. Temperance appeared from the side of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. "You want me to go instead?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "No, they'd sooner spit than sell." She nodded. "Be careful." "I always am." But he wasn't sure that would be enough. The road into Six Stones felt longer than usual. Every mile seemed to echo with hoofbeats that didn't belong, the kind that rode in without permission and left behind rumors like hoofprints in wet clay. By the time Elias reached the edge of town, the weight in his chest had grown sharp. He stopped first at the blacksmith. No words exchanged, just a glance, a shrug, and a turned back. Then the general store. Inside, the bell above the door rang, but no one greeted him. Mrs. Rugg, who usually ran the counter with a voice like molasses, stood behind the shelves arranging tins. She didn't look up. Elias waited a moment, then approached. "Need 2 sacks of cornmeal, a length of rope, ½ pound of lye." She wrote the list down on a scrap of paper. Didn't speak. When she brought the items, she set them down on the counter with the indifference of a banker processing a debt. "That all?" "That's all," Elias said. She tallied the price, took the coins, and dropped them into the tin without counting aloud. As Elias turned to go, a man by the barrel spoke, not loud, not angry, just clear enough to carry. "Funny how he's still around." Elias paused. The air went thinner. "Funny how she is too," said another. He didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of tobacco and cold iron from the nearby stable. The mule snorted, sensing something Elias hadn't yet seen. Then he did. Burke Hollowell, standing beside the stagecoach post, arms crossed, hat low, smile wrong. "Didn't think I'd see you in town today," Burke said. Elias walked past him, loading the sacks without speaking. Burke followed. "Heard what happened out by the river. My boys tell stories. Some of 'em don't walk too well now." Elias tied the last bundle down and turned. "Could say the same for your cattle thieves." Burke chuckled. "She's got a quick trigger finger. That one. She's got a right to defend herself. She got a right to be here." "She's here," Elias said flatly. "That's enough." Burke leaned in, his voice dropping. "Folks are scared, Elias, saying she's cursed, saying things ain't natural since she arrived. Things ain't been natural since Sarah died." Burke's smile faltered for a blink, then returned, colder. "You keep riding this road. You'll find it ends somewhere you don't want to be." Elias didn't answer. He climbed into the cart and turned the mule toward home. The trail back felt steeper, though the land hadn't changed. What had changed was the way the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt full, of judgment, of betrayal, of a town that had decided kindness was too costly. At Dry Creek Bluff, Temperance sat outside with a wash basin, scrubbing soot from the skillet. Her hands were cracked, knuckles scabbed from too much work and too little rest. When she saw him, she didn't smile. Just stood. "They say anything?" she asked. They said enough. He unloaded the cart while she gathered the goods. Neither of them spoke much, but the weight of the words unspoken was heavier than iron. That night, after Grady had gone to bed, Elias lit a second lamp and placed it on the table. The flame cast soft gold across the room, catching on the buckle of his belt and the curve of Temperance's cheek. "I saw Hollowell," he said. She didn't flinch. "Of course you did. He's not backing down. Neither am I." They sat across from each other in that quiet, like two rivers carved into the same canyon wall, never touching, but always close. "I keep thinking," she said, "if I was smaller, quieter, easier. Maybe things would be different. Elias looked at her, hard. If you were different, we'd be dead. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. You don't mean that. I do, he said. You saved my life. You've kept this place running. You've given Grady someone to believe in. Her hands folded on the table. And you. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the flame between them. You're the first person I've let into this house since Sarah. That don't come easy. I know, but I ain't sorry I did. Silence settled again, this time softer. Later, while checking the barn for broken boards, Temperance noticed something by the chicken coop. A line of feathers, white, bloodied, trailing off into the darkness. One of the hens was missing. The fence had been pried up. She followed the trail with a lantern, shotgun slung across her back. At the edge of the yard, she found the tracks, boot prints, and a mark carved into the fence post, a half moon above a crooked arrow. Burke's family mark. She returned to the house, face pale but resolute. Elias was by the stove, sharpening a blade. They were here, she said, close, watching. He looked up, eyes hardening. This ain't over, he said, and from outside, through the thin walls and colder wind, a single note nailed to the gate began to flap in the night air like a tattered flag, though neither of them had put it there. Last warning. The hammer mark in the wood was unmistakable, sharp, deep, deliberate. It was Burke Hollowell's. The wind turned sharp that morning, slicing between the barn boards like it was looking for something to cut loose. Elias felt it before the rooster crowed. A stillness in the dark. Right before dawn broke over Dry Creek Bluff, not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that warned of movement. He lay in bed for a long time with his eyes open, watching shadows lengthen across the ceiling, listening to the groan of the rafters. A man didn't get many instincts left once the world beat most of them out of him. But this one burned in his gut, like whiskey before a fight. When Grady had once asked, "If Mama's watching from that hill, maybe she can make the bad men go away." Elias had said yes, not out of belief, but because boys needed to believe. Today, as he stared out the window toward the distant willow, he wished he'd believed it himself. He got up without speaking. The floor was cold, the house colder. Temperance was already at the stove, her face drawn in the pale light. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't have to. Her hand lingered on the edge of the table, steadying herself, not from fear, but from readiness. Grady stirred in the other room. Elias crouched and whispered to him, low and firm, "You stay inside today. Hear me? Don't open that door unless it's me or Miss Tem." Grady sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Is it Hollowell?" "Don't worry about that," Elias said. "Just do as I say." By the time the sun broke the horizon, Elias had the horses saddled, the tools stored, and the extra shells tucked into the folds of his coat. He'd dug out the old rifle from the chest under Sarah's trunk. The one he hadn't touched since the war. It still smelled like sweat and oil and fire. Temperance stepped outside carrying the shotgun. Her hair was braided tight, jaw set like stone. She wore her brother's locket around her neck, the one with the sketch folded inside. A boy with the same eyes, lost to the rail camps outside Tucson. They didn't speak. There wasn't any point. The air was brittle, sharp enough to make the skin on their faces sting. Across the ridge, beyond the bend in the fence, came the low thunder of hooves. They came in slow. 4 riders, with Burke Hollowell at the front. His coat was lined with wolf fur, and he wore it like a man who hadn't known real cold in his life. His hat sat low. The grin beneath it was anything but friendly. "You were warned," he called. Elias stood his ground. "You brought guns to steal cattle. You brought fire to burn fences. You brought words to wound." Burke leaned forward. "And now, I bring justice." Temperance raised the shotgun. Not quite aiming, but not far from it either. "You don't know the meaning of the word." Burke gestured behind him. "These men are here to make sure the law gets enforced." "What law? The one I paid for? The one that says Mercer never filed proper claim to this land after his wife passed? That he's squatting with some witch who shoots my men?" Elias cocked the rifle. The sound snapped across the yard like thunder on glass. "You don't speak her name," he said. Burke's eyes flared. He turned to his men. "Take it." The first rider kicked forward. Temperance fired before his boot even hit the ground. The shotgun roared, and the rider went down, spinning sideways, screaming. Gunfire erupted. Elias dropped to one knee, leveled the rifle, and fired. One shot caught a second man in the shoulder. He tumbled from his horse, screaming curses through clenched teeth. The third fired back. A bullet whined past Temperance's ear, chipping the porch beam behind her. Elias took the shot. Clean, center chest. The man crumpled. Smoke curled around them now, thick and bitter. The last man had fled, turning tail as soon as the first fell. But Burke hadn't moved. Temperance stepped out from behind the post, eyes blazing. Burke drew. She didn't flinch, but Elias was faster. His shot hit Burke in the side, high enough not to kill, but hard enough to knock him from the saddle. The man hit the ground like a sack of bones, crying out as he clutched at his ribs. "Enough," Elias said, stepping forward, rifle trained, breathing hard. Burke writhed in the dirt. "You're finished? You think anyone's going to let you stay now?" Temperance stood beside Elias, her voice like gravel and steel. "We don't need permission." Burke spat blood, his face twisted in rage. "You'll burn for this." "Not before you," Elias said. They didn't kill him. Didn't have to. Letting him crawl away was worse. By the time they bound the wounded and covered the dead, the sun was high and hot, as if nothing had happened. The cabin stood tall, riddled with bullet holes, but still standing. The fence would need mending again. The barn would need patching, but they were still alive. Grady ran from the house as soon as the shooting stopped, straight into Temperance's arms. "You're okay," he whispered. "You didn't leave me." "Never," she said, holding him close. Elias watched them, the heat from the rifle still in his hands. The weight of it sinking deeper into his chest than any bullet ever could. They spent the rest of the day working in silence. The dead were buried near the edge of the field, far from Sarah's willow, far from anything sacred. That night, after Grady had gone to bed, Elias and Temperance sat on the porch, their legs stretched out, feet aching, fingers nicked and blackened. The sky above was velvet blue, littered with stars. "You don't have to stare," he said, his voice quiet. She looked away. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he said, "but I can't ask you to stay either, not when there's still danger." She hesitated. "You're not asking. I chose to, and not just because I got nowhere else to go." His eyes met hers. There was something raw there, something vulnerable. "You've made things better," he said. "The work, the food, Grady, me." Her breath caught. "Then I'll stay," she whispered, "as long as you want." He looked out at the field, the fence line, the moonlight catching the tips of the grass. The danger wasn't over, but for once the night didn't feel like a threat. They sat there, side by side, hands nearly touching, as the breeze passed over them, soft and slow. And in the silence, Elias spoke once more, his voice rough and certain. "We live, and we stay." And now the wind moves softer over Dry Creek Bluff, brushing past bullet-splintered fence posts and the old barn roof patched with stubborn hands, carrying with it the echo of all that came and all that stayed behind. and if you stand just right beneath the willow tree that leans westward like it's bowing to a ghost only it can see, you might hear the breath of something sacred still holding on, something quieter than prayer but heavier than silence. For the land remembers even when the people forget, and the cracked soil that once bore nothing but dust now carries the boot prints of a woman who would not bend, and a man who bent too long before learning how to stand again, and a boy who saw them both and called them home. And though the house still leans a little when the winter winds howl and the gate creaks like a sigh when it swings open at dawn, there is warmth behind its walls now, warmth and bread and laughter and stories told low beside the fire, and the chickens still scatter when they hear boots on gravel, but they come back quicker than before. And the goats don't flinch when the wind slams the barn door shut. And some nights Elias still sits alone, with his coat buttoned high and his hat low, fingers resting near the old letter Sarah wrote him during the war, stained with time and words too kind to fold away. But now he isn't waiting for anything, just listening to the quiet like it's a friend and not a burden. And Temperance, well, she rises before the sun, like always, washes her hands in cold water and rubs the stiffness from her back, her locket still tucked close to her chest, where her brother's face looks out with pencil lines and old grief. But her eyes are clearer now, and her laughter deeper, like thunder before a summer rain. And if the town of 6 Stones watches her with wary glances when she rides in for feed or to collect the post, she doesn't flinch, doesn't nod. Just walks straight and steady with her chin held high and her name no longer a secret carried like a burden. And Grady, that boy with dust on his cheeks and hope in his hands, he's taller now, and his stories stretch longer than a fence line in the heat. And he says, Miss Tem, less and Ma more when no one's listening, and maybe that's how healing begins, not with a declaration, but with a boy forgetting to be afraid of love. And justice didn't come in a courtroom or on parchment signed in ink. It came in the way Hollowell's grave grew wild with weeds, and no one came to tend it, not even the men who used to follow him like hounds on a leash, and the townsfolk don't speak much of what happened up on the bluff that fall, but their eyes flick toward the hills when the wind shifts, and some tip their hats out of habit or guilt or both, and now and then a traveler stops by, looking for work or bread or a story, and they leave with a fuller belly and something like hope tucked in their chest, and the land that bore witness to all of it, holds no grudges, only footprints, only fence rails, only seeds that finally took root in hard soil, and the ghosts are quieter now, their murmurs softer, their grief no longer sharp, and there's a carved piece of wood above the door that Grady whittled himself says, "Home ain't what you find, it's what you keep standing." And on warm evenings when the chickens settle and the stars blink open one by one, like old friends returning, the fire crackles low and Elias hums a tune he hasn't heard since Sarah danced barefoot in the kitchen, and Temperance sits beside him, not needing to speak, her hand near his but never forced. And maybe the world doesn't change with gunfire or speeches. Maybe it changes with a pot of stew, a mended shirt, a gate rebuilt, not because it keeps things out, but because it invites what matters in. And maybe we were never meant to be legends, just decent, just steady, just kind when it counts. And if you've still got a piece of that belief tucked somewhere in your heart, something about honor, or redemption, or the courage to stay when leaving would be easier, then leave a small sign here, a comment, a word, a breath in the night that says you remember too. And if this story moved something in you, like a wheel finally catching on dry trail, consider joining us again on this porch, this fire, this tale we pass along, like old wisdom under oil lamplight, and subscribe to our channel. If you want to hear what comes next, because the West holds more stories than bullets, more truth than graves, and sometimes all it takes to change a life is for one person to believe in a forgotten woman, a tired man, and a boy with dreams big enough to break a silence, because justice may come late. But it still matters, And honor may be buried, but it ain't ever erased.